All right, guys, bang, bang. Super excited to have Alex here. Thanks for doing this, man.
Thank you for having me, Pomp. I'm excited to be on. I've listened to a bunch of your interviews and they're terrific, and glad to be in the hot seat.
For sure. Well, the big news, obviously, is you recently left your job and have struck out on your own to go build a dominant one-man media company for now. So we'll get to that in a second. But for those that don't know you, maybe let's start with your background and kind of how we got to you writing about large technology companies.
Yeah, so I came out of school. I studied industrial and labor relations, came out in the middle of the recession in 2009, didn't have a job, sat on my parents' couch, and was like, what do I do? Um, so it was a moment where the internet was starting to rise as an impactful marketing platform. And I took a marketing job. And I went in-house as a media buyer at New York City's Economic Development Corporation and came in. They were doing a lot of print advertising. And I was like, we can reach the same readers for less money on the internet, and we can target them better. And we don't only have to buy on publications, we can buy on Google AdWords, we can use Facebook, and we could use LinkedIn. And they said, really? And I said, oh, yeah, this is all possible. And so I just made it a point to really learn how to spend money best on the internet to reach audiences. And it was amazing just to see their willingness. Like, as a government agency, they don't move really fast, but I had a $10,000 budget for each campaign. And it was amazing to see their willingness to let me kind of spray it around and see what the results are. And by doing that, I started to learn the inner workings of how online advertising works. Then I was in New York for a while, at this agency, and Bloomberg was the mayor at the time, kept talking about how important tech was to the future of the city. And at a certain point, I was like, I'm done hearing him talk about it. I want to go do it. And I was like, just get me to a tech company, any tech company. And so I signed on as a lead development representative at an ad tech company that sold order management software to publishers. It's about the most boring type of tech company you could possibly be at, maybe like a neck above an ERP system, but not too much further than that. And by doing that, I learned the inner workings of, I had been buying advertising through the internet. Now I started to learn a little bit more about the plumbing. And at a certain point, I was like, do I want to, keep trying to sell this software, which was all direct sold. We were moving automated as an industry. And so I said I could keep trying to sell this stuff, or I could start to write about where the energy was going. I chose the second path, went to advertising age, started writing about ad tech as a journalist. It was my first full-time staff job. And then, change you've been a part of, right? I saw all the money moving from independent ad tech out to Silicon Valley. And all of a sudden, it wasn't like the tube moguls and the Yumis that were the power players in the industry. It was Facebook and Google and Twitter and Snapchat. And I said I could stay in New York and, write obituaries, or I can move to Silicon Valley and start to figure out how these companies work. And I decided to make the move to Silicon Valley. And that's been the challenge since I've been here.
Got it. And so I think part of what's so fascinating about the work that you've had is there's multiple kind of levels or depths to it, right? So one is just, hey, where's these industries going? How do these platforms work? But also then there's tens of thousands of people that work at these companies now, right? And so there's this kind of entire human layer on top of it. Maybe talk a little bit about some of the stories that you wrote about and the process that goes into really how you built your reputation covering those large technology companies.
Right. So I showed up here. I showed up here in San Francisco in May 2015. So almost exactly 5 years ago. And I had been this ad trade reporter. And so I said, let me make it a point to try to cover everything I possibly can, sink my teeth into these companies in every direction possible and see where it leads me. And it's interesting, like, you cover an ad tech company, like, it's pretty simple. You have the sell side, you have the buy side, you have some data layered in between. That's what you're dealing with. But when you cover a company like Facebook, you're dealing with, not only the advertising side, but you're dealing with politics, entertainment, how society works. You're looking at AI and media, and so I decided to go pretty wide in the beginning and just cover whatever I could. And then I started zeroing in on the things that I thought were interesting. And so to me, like, the idea was to stop covering the symptoms as much as to cover the physiology. Look at the product decisions, look at the culture of these companies, and by deeply understanding and conveying the repercussions and the results that these systems produce, people could better understand exactly what's going on inside the company. So instead of, for instance, saying, how could Facebook not apply a label to Trump's tweet? Or how did Twitter apply a label to Trump's tweet? You know, for me, the more interesting thing is looking at, why do these platforms, from an elemental level, start to incentivize the type of posts where you end up having a world leader who could end up putting stuff out there that merits a label or even that discussion. Like, that type of stuff, in my opinion, doesn't happen by accident. And I wanted to learn, A, why do these companies' products spit out the type of communication that they do? And then B, the thing that motivated the book was, um, it was kind of astonishing to me that as these companies got bigger, they actually grew stronger. We're used to companies getting big and getting bureaucratic and starting to, batten down the hatches and protect an asset and milk that asset until there's nothing left, and then they become Xerox. But these companies are doing something very differently. They just become stronger as they get bigger. And I knew there was a cultural story behind that. And I just wanted to find some way to go out and tell it. And luckily, I got the chance with the book.
Got it. And so the book, maybe talk a little bit about kind of just some of the takeaways there, because what's fascinating to me is we've seen a number of books now written about individual companies, right? And people spend months, if not more than a year, really going deep on one single company and trying to just understand what's happening to be able to write in depth a full length book. You did that for multiple companies, right? And so there's this element of almost, it's a more difficult challenge when you're trying to cover so many different businesses. So what are some of those takeaways that you had from writing the book?
Yeah, and I think this is the first book that Amazon, Facebook, Google, and Microsoft have all participated in together. So those are typically rivals, and they came together on this one. Um, So I would say that what motivated my book is a different question, right? Most of the books that are out about these technology companies are, what did you do? What are you going to do? For me, the question was, how do you do what you do? And that's when you start to get into things that you see, instead of telling a history, you start to talk a little bit more, and it's kind of nerdy, but about process and technology and culture and leadership that's enabled them to be successful. And the more I dug into it, the more I saw there were some real parallels in the way these companies operate. One of the things that they all do is that they have this view of work. And you might have seen this, in your various steps, but they view work as, you're either going to be spending your time creating something new, or you're going to be spending your time supporting something that exists. And what they've done is minimize the time people spent supporting what exists using various forms of technology, AI, automation, collaboration tools to make room for them to create something new. And that's kind of my idea with the title, which is always day one. The idea is that they're always reinventing themselves. It's as if their first day with little regard for what came beforehand. And they do this by making much more time for people to come up with new ideas and bring them to life. And then the second half of that is they've built systems that once somebody has an idea, they're able to get it to a decision maker with incredible speed. So at Facebook, you probably saw, if you have an idea, you could bring it right to Zuck, or maybe somebody who's going to tell Zuck about it. In a typical company, you tell your boss when you have an idea, and then your boss laughs at you, and then maybe they'll bring it to their boss, and their boss will laugh, and they'll bring it to their boss. And if anybody along the chain says, no, your idea is gone, and a startup across the street who's now operating with the lowest startup costs in history, who's now operating with the fastest time to create a company in history, can go create that idea while it's making its way through useless middle management who are all laughing at you. And so the tech giants have done a really good job of giving people the permission to come up with ideas, which is important, and then making sure that those ideas have a way to get to decision makers and don't get caught up in that corporate muck.
Yeah, I'll even take a step further. I actually tell people that one of the things that was the most surprising to me at Facebook is I would see people come up with these ideas and they would go to kind of somebody who would have brought it to Zuck. And the response was not I like that idea, I don't like that idea. It was something to the effect of like, well, if you're an engineer, like, why don't you prototype it? Or if you're not an engineer, like, why don't you go try to find somebody who will prototype it with you? And then let's talk about, does this work, does it not, once something's actually built, right? Kind of this idea of like code wins arguments. And to your point, like, it's just all about speed, right? And the speed really leads to that innovation, which is pretty interesting. Any kind of funny stories from the process of writing the book? And anything that didn't make it into the book that you just found either funny or you think people would enjoy hearing about?
Yeah, definitely. A couple of fun Zuck stories if you're up for them. Um, First is, so I knew Zuckerberg uses Snapchat, and I kind of wanted to get him into this position where he admitted it to me. And so I'm telling him, we're talking about stories, and I have an idea of how stories came to be. Again, this is part of the feedback culture. People telling him that you need to do this or else your products are going to die. And I knew that he was using Snapchat, and he alluded to, like, watching stories, and I was like, so you did it on Snapchat? And he goes, well, and Instagram. And I was like, but you use Snapchat? And he goes, yeah, but I use all of our competitors' products. And then he said he was when Facebook was starting to experiment into the dating app scene, he had to try them out. So he got onto the dating apps with his own picture and started experimenting with them. And he said he was on this one app where you match with a new person every day. Um, and he thought it was a cool looking app. So he showed it to his wife, Priscilla. He goes, hey, Priscilla, check it out. Here's this dating app that's pretty interesting. And she looked at the person on screen and was scheduled to have dinner with her the next night. So anyway, it's kind of one of those stories where I'm like, okay, I'm sitting here next to Zuckerberg and he's telling me he's using dating apps to meet his wife's friends. That's interesting. Um,
Yeah, I mean, and
mhm,
look, I think part of that is
mhm,
like, it's
mhm,
funny, right? And one, those are great stories, but two is uh,
mhm,
it also shows the level of maybe obsession's the wrong word, but just really
mhm,
wanting to understand how technology works, what are other people doing, what should we be doing, right? And being critical of products. And I've said over and over again, Mark was probably one of the only people I've ever met that could sit in a room and talk about high level strategy of an entire division within a multinational corporation, and then literally during the demo zoom in and pick up why is that pixel off, right? And just the
mhm.
ability to kind of go up and down. And one time somebody said to me, who'd been at the company a long time, they said, look, you got to remember that Mark has more context than anybody else who works here. He's been working on it longer than
Mhm.
everybody. So he has the story behind every single one of these products. He's seen them all get developed and all this. And if you kind of go across all the major tech companies, that is one thing that remains constant, is most of them are still run by their founders, or the founders are still in some sort of influential position, which I'm assuming that you kind of saw as one of those patterns across the companies, right?
Yeah, totally. And I think that, like, you're right. The way that he's using these apps shows a willingness to believe in a product outside of Facebook, right? Like, the problem that companies get into is they believe that their software is the best, therefore they'll never even try another person's software. And, like, to me, it was surprising that Zuckerberg is using Snapchat and dating apps. But, like, looking back, of course he is. Like, Amazon has an interesting leadership principle called invent and simplify. And the idea is, you invent and then you build systems to make sure you're not spending too much time supporting that existing product. But they say explicitly, we don't have this dedication to using stuff only invented here. If something was invented elsewhere, we'll use it. And we're going with best of breed. You contrast that with Microsoft. When Steve Ballmer was running Microsoft, you couldn't bring an Apple product into the campus. Steve Ballmer once pretended to throw an iPhone in a meeting with people. So people sort of knew, if I'm working on a Mac, even if I'm developing for Mac users, I'm going to get a dirty look if I'm working on this computer in Microsoft campus. And I think it sort of shows when you have a willingness and an appreciation to ideas from anywhere. when you have a willingness to admit that other companies are developing good software and you want to learn why they've done well, then you're going to be in good shape. But when you want to sort of, again, look and protect your asset and think that that's the only thing that matters in the world and that all your competitors don't have a chance in the world, that arrogance ends up leading to bad business outcomes.
For sure. And since you are the go-to expert on these big tech companies, what's your assessment of kind of their role in the world right now? Obviously, there's everything from the coronavirus to the economic crisis to now we've got kind of social unrest in the United States and this debate over do you label tweets or posts, do you not, and kind of what is a platform's role? Like, how do you see the major tech companies playing their role in society, given that, again, it's not just on one issue? Like, they pretty much touch everything at this point. How do you kind of evaluate that role?
Yeah, I think they play important roles. Are they the only actors in this world? No. Like, um, when we talk about Facebook's impact in the US, we have to talk about Fox News and MSNBC and CNN. When we talk about Twitter's impact in the world, we also have to talk about the way the president uses it, not just the product. So but they're all self-reinforcing systems. I mean, we know they're definitely changing the way people in society see information. I mean, the anti-vax movement is a good example, right? I mean, I don't think this is surprising, which is sad, but the anti-vax groups on Facebook are growing at double the rate that they were a year ago. And so what's going to happen when we have a coronavirus vaccine and, people, by the tens of thousands refuse to take it because their mind's been poisoned inside these groups? Then you get into, pretty tricky territory. So I do think they're definitely changing the way people think. I mean, that was appealing to me, when I started going after this beat, is I would realize that these companies have a pretty important role to play in the way that information gets to people. Now, when I was coming from the ad world, I was mostly interested in what publications they were going to support. But it turns out that they've, not surprisingly, played a role everywhere. And like, my only thought on this is they got to slow it down a little bit. Like, they're too fast. And the share button and the retweet button just enable like quick, unthinking dissemination of bad information. And if those buttons even had like you have to wait 10 seconds before you hit them, or you have to click the link before you retweet the story, I think we would be living in a better society.
Yeah, and it's interesting because now what we're starting to see is kind of a divergence in maybe not ideology, but like action, right? So the obvious one, and maybe we just talk directly about it, is the president's tweets, where Twitter has decided to go ahead and put a label over those tweets. I think they've now extended that to other government accounts that are tweeting similar things or the same things. They've also gone and done it to other politicians. Facebook instead has taken the position that for the most part, they're going to be a kind of free open platform. They don't want to make decisions on labeling things and not labeling them. They're obviously under heat for that. Kind of walk me through a little bit like your understanding based on Zuck and Jack specifically. Those decisions are coming from the top. This isn't a policy person making it. Like, at the end of the day, they are maybe not betting their companies, but definitely stepping into a very controversial situation. And so the CEOs themselves are making these decisions.
Yeah. And one of the things that's really disappointed me in this whole situation is that the employees protesting and the media have only focused on the labels. And I'd love for them to focus on what is going on inside your platforms that are making them turn into what some people have really accurately referred to as anger video games. And where like the points are retweets and the points are shares and the points are reach. And why is the most incendiary content from the most fringe actors being amplified this way on these platforms? I mean, they've created status games. So people who have mainstream status are not actually going in and playing in them, which means the fringe occupies all of the room. And then since the fringe is making all this content for these platforms, they're just getting amplified like crazy with the retweet and share button. So then we get into the situation where the media sees like the fringe say, be pretty successful, and then say we need to, take this stuff down. And that just gives them fuel and say, see, this is, we've been here all along, and the mainstream has kept us down, and they don't want us to be successful. But of course, that's not the case. They've just been successful by nature of the fact that they've rode the systems themselves, and become pretty popular, on the platforms and in the world because of it. So I'd like to see that fixed. And I'd like to see more discussion about that, because until we really get into that discussion, we're kind of talking about window dressing. Now, as far as the labels go, I don't really think they're going to make a difference. Like, Twitter put the label on Trump's tweet, and the rioting didn't stop. So they fact check his tweet about mail-in ballots, but I don't think that's going to make him stop trying to start to cast aspersions on the validity of this next election. He's behind in the polls. Why do you think he's doing this? So ultimately, I think that Jack has been more willing to act than Mark. And so this sort of ends up following that type of pattern. But I know this is sort of unsatisfying, but I think that neither of them are in the right until they start to examine the fundamentals of what their platforms are doing and start to fix them.
Yeah, and it's really interesting because I do think that most people are focused on this idea of like, are the platforms becoming publishers? And they think of it in this like editorial perspective, but it's always about, did they put the label or did they not? Did they censor or did they not? Mm. And coming from somebody who's worked on these systems and understands, some of the complexity of them, like, there's a lot more to, and it's very nuanced, right? It could literally just be, hey, Alex posted something and he gets less reach because of a word he used, right? Or the easy example I always tell people is on Facebook, for example, if you see a post and everyone starts writing congratulations in the comments, it explodes, right? Because obviously if everyone's writing congratulations, it must be this like super engaging, awesome thing for this person. And everyone then gets this dopamine hit, and it's like this self-fulfilling, cycle. But that's kind of an editorial decision as well, right? Like, what goes behind the algorithm.
Exactly. That's exactly it. Like, they've been editors, they are editors, they will be editors. And whether they put a label on a tweet or send you to a fact check, what's happening underneath is playing a far greater role than when you see them act with a quote unquote heavy hand. Like, let's look at the systems and let's look at the belly of the beast, versus its haircut.
All right. So most people who listen to this will agree in some form or fashion that the platforms have a hard time claiming, hey, we're the phone company, right? The phone company, the analogy there is just, hey, look, they don't listen to they're not supposed to listen to the calls, right? And they definitely don't, they don't say, hey, I'm trying to call Alex, but because we're going to talk politics, like, I'm not going to connect the call, right? Or I'm going to cut you short at 5 minutes rather than give you 30 minutes because we're going to talk about something in the conversation. So it's not quite an apples to apples comparison, but what is the solution, right? And so when you talk about like examining the actual kind of belly of the beast, like, let's say that they say, okay, you know what, we have this problem. We're going to go ahead and be very introspective. We're going to take this seriously. Like, what do you think is the direction that they can go, or that like finish line, if you will, where they end up creating solutions?
Yeah. So I don't want to be one of those people who say they must do something, because, as you know, unless we test something, we don't really know what the outcome is going to be. But I do know what I want to test. So I want to test and see what the outcome is if 3 things on the share button. 1 is if you remove share and retweet completely. 2 is if you put a 10 or 15 second timer, on that retweet. So you have to wait 15 seconds after you've seen it before you can hit it. And 3 is if you have to click the link before you can hit that button. And we know, research shows, if you don't hesitate, you're much more likely to share fake and sensationalized news. And I would say probably outrage as well, right? If we put that pause in artificially, I am really curious to see what the platforms will find out. And my guess is that it will create a much better environment inside. The other thing is status, right? So here's the other thing I want to test. I'd love to test what these platforms look like without follower counts and without retweet and like counts. Now, look, these are going to have, potentially some negative effects, right? Because we might not be able to tell someone who's pretty influential from a bot. So it will put their, opinion down, kind of on the same plane, which has been an issue. So I'm not sure this is an issue, but I'd like to actually see what it looks like. And then maybe you could just do tiers, right? Because think about it, Twitter counts up every single follower that you have, you can see it. And anybody on Twitter knows that that's freaking addicting and hard not to check. What if Twitter did a tier? Your 500 plus, your 1,000 plus, your 2,000 plus, 3,000. Then all of a sudden, it becomes less of a status game and more of a signal in terms of audience. And I think that like if we end up testing things of this nature on, along the lines of what I'm suggesting, we will end up getting to a more civil place. Because again, this status game with quick virality to me seems unwinnable for everyone. I mean, it's pretty good for engagement. It keeps people checking these things more than they should. But if we're thinking about the way that society is impacted by these platforms, uh, these are some of the fixes I'd like to see.
Yeah, and I guess one of the things, and I'm kind of thinking out loud here, but really, if you think about following people without the follower accounts, email lists have basically done that, right? So like, hey, I subscribe to an
Exactly.
email list. A lot of times I don't know how many subscribers they have. I may have a good sense of it's big or it's not. But really, unless they tell me, I've got zero clue. I'm just subscribing for that specific content, which is kind of, it sounds directionally one of the things that those tests would try to see. Is that make the platform quote unquote better based on the metrics that you're using?
Yeah, and Eugene Wei has this great post about, he calls it status as a service, and talks about how humans are status hungry monkeys, and we use these platforms as the incentives teach us to. And again, like, it's not like this is the first time society is fraying. Like we had a Holocaust before Twitter and Facebook. So I don't think they're the cause of all evil, but I do think that the public discourse that we have is important. And it does lead to a lot of outcomes in real life. And so if we can find ways to improve it versus say, oh, this is just the way it is, it's just going to be better for all of us. And we can maybe, I know we're not in a time where we can start talking about social media with this utopian view that it was talked about in the beginning, but I don't think the promise is gone yet. I think we can get to a better place with social media, just not the type of social media we have today.
Yeah, and the other thing I always, remind people of, and I'm biased. Look, I worked at some of these companies, right? It's just like they've had a net positive impact on society, in my opinion, in the sense of, how many people are now connected and all this stuff. Now, there's bad things that came with it. I think they would be the first ones to admit that, there's challenges and they've got to try to solve them. But I think that these are really important conversations, and really what we're asking every large tech company to do is do the impossible, right? Give us all the benefits without any of the downsides. But it's some of the downsides are definitely worth focusing on and addressing in the short term. What's going on with Google and Amazon and some of the like non-social media large tech companies, in your opinion?
Yeah, so Google is in the middle. So in the book, I talk a little bit about how Google, people think Google is this company that figured out how to do search and just wrote it to a hundred billions of dollars of valuation, and that was it. But Google is this company that's really gone through so many different transformations in its history. It started out as a website you would access on Microsoft's browser, Internet Explorer. Then it really became a browser extension on Internet Explorer. I don't know if many people remember, but the primary way that people used to access Google was through Google Toolbar, which is an extension you would install onto Internet Explorer, and it would like show up in the browser's Chrome. Chrome is everything that's not part of the browsing window, and you would type your searches in, and it would show up in the browser. Actually, more than 60% of Google search went through Toolbar at a certain time. So Google was an extension. Then the Google team saw, led by Sundar Pichai, who's now the CEO of Alphabet, they saw that Microsoft was starting to mess with them a little bit with that toolbar. As you might imagine, Microsoft was like, we're delivering billions of dollars of value to Google, and we own the browser. So why are we continuing to do this? And so Google realized that the longer it depended on Microsoft, which was then working on live search, which would become Bing, it was going to be dead. And that's when it really had to build its own browser. And it's funny, I remember seeing ads for Chrome and being like, why is Google building a browser? Why is the search engine so intent on the browser? But Chrome saved the company. And without building its own successful browser where you can type your searches in the address bar, we might be binging today. Like that might be the verb. Um, and so that's obviously Chrome worked out really well for them. So Google's safe. But then we move from desktop to mobile. All of a sudden, they need to reinvent again. And they do that using Android, which they acquire and then build up. And then, we start getting into this mobile world. All of a sudden, um, voice computing happens. And what you do with Google is you ask it questions. What time is this going to happen at? Where did this take place? And people start asking the Amazon Echo these questions. This is Google's bread and butter. So Google needed to reinvent again. And that's where it started developing the Google Assistant. Sundar brings the whole company together, and said he puts this big slide up in front of the company, and it's all Google's products, and then there's like this squiggly line, and it points to Assistant and said the number one thing that we're doing in this company is turning what we have into one cohesive assistant, the Google Assistant. And I think that this is going to be Google's future, is whether it can make that assistant overtake the Echo. I can't say here. Let me pause, mute it. Sorry, overtake Alexa, or it can't lose that. And if the Google Assistant is good, then all of a sudden it propels all the Google products you use. It propels Android, and it propels the Google Home, which is still second to the Echo. But if you look at the order, the Echo has the lead. Then you got Google. Then there's like an other category, and somewhere deep inside that other category, which has very few units sold, is Apple's HomePod. So Apple is totally letting this revolution slip by it. In terms of Amazon, Amazon's like this invention factory. Its culture, I talked a little bit about, working on ideas versus working on execution, and its culture has, baked in like incredible technology that allow its employees to focus on invention. And that's why Amazon's been able to go from, an online bookseller to a massive first-party marketplace, a third-party marketplace, logistics and fulfillment operation, a cloud services platform, a voice computing platform, a hardware manufacturer, and a grocer and an Academy Award-winning movie studio, is because the company knows how to operate. Its processes baked in. And we're starting to see some of the fruits of, its most ambitious AI program, called Hands Off the Wheel. And I go into that in depth in the book. Hands Off the Wheel is a way that Amazon used machine learning to automate a good amount of tasks in its retail organization. So its retail employees were on the phone with like brands like Tide and saying, we need this many detergent units and this many fulfillment centers, at this time for this price. And Amazon looked at itself and was like, we got 2 decades worth of retail purchase data. Why are we having people do this? We can just have software. And then slowly but surely over the last few years, they've worked to automate all of these tasks. So if you're Tied right now, a machine sends you the purchase order. You get an email, right? You go and negotiate with a portal. The pricing and promotions are all done with technology, not people. Used to be a very big organization inside Amazon. And by freeing those people up, the company's really been able to invent, its next new products. My favorite story is one of this guy, Dilip Kumar, who ran pricing and promotions in the retail organization. He goes and spends like a year and a half under Bezos, taking meetings that Bezos was taking as his technical advisor. By the time he's done, pricing and promotions is totally automated. So he can't go back to this division. So he gets together with a bunch of people from Amazon's retail organization that are feeling displaced and need to do something new. And they say, why don't we use technology to solve the most annoying part of shopping in real life, which is checkout? And that is the team that developed Amazon Go, which you can just walk in and take something out, and then it charges you. There's no scanning. You scan in once with a QR code, grab what you want, and then walk out. It feels like stealing. Probably the future of brick and mortar retail, period. I think that these systems we're going to see in supermarkets all over the place, and in stores. And I think that Amazon's really hit on something with this. And it all happened because they were able to use technology to change the way they work and make room for more invention and have the process to invent. So I think that company is, really good shape from a business standpoint. The only caveat I'll make with Amazon is the company needs more empathy. Uh, you can tell by the way that they've engaged in this coronavirus moment that they've fired their whistleblowers. They've tried to run a nasty PR campaign targeting somebody in their fulfillment center that spoke up, saying he was inarticulate, and they wanted to make him the face of worker resistance. And honestly, like, it's much easier just to treat your workers well than to go through all this effort and a PR campaign to try to make somebody look bad. And I think at a certain point, Amazon needs to realize that, because you know, consumers might one day actually say, I want to go to a company that's first priority is making sure that the people that work for it are safe, and making sure that the businesses that sell into it are sustainable. That's good for everyone. And if Amazon doesn't prioritize that, it's going to be in bad shape.
Yeah, that's a fantastic overview. It's fascinating how the use of technology across these companies, this idea of not spending time supporting things that have been built and just constantly innovating, constantly inventing, is kind of that layer of commonality across all of them. In terms of also inventing or building something, you recently made the jump to leave your job and go it alone. Maybe talk a little bit about what you're doing and kind of what the thought process was behind leaving and starting big technology.
Yeah, so I was at BuzzFeed for 5 years as a senior technology reporter. In BuzzFeed years, I think that's 35 or so. It's a long time in a digital media company. And I released Always Day One in April. And it happened, we released in the middle of a pandemic, which is, if I write a second book, I'll make sure to not release in a pandemic, because it adds an element of challenge to the whole system that isn't great. And I basically kind of looked at what's going to happen to me in my life over the next handful of years, and said, I could stay here and, stay in this staff job, hopefully, and try to ride out what's going on in this pandemic, and, keep reporting on these companies in the traditional news ecosystem. Or I could just try to take my future and my destiny in my own hands. And that means helping to get the word out about the book in a way that I wasn't beforehand, because again, like, full-time reporter job is pretty demanding. And I think that there are some lessons in the book that are valuable to, anyone, no matter what industry they're in, and spent a long time working on it and figured it was worth that effort. And then the other thing is, so, I think that, and you are, totally, you've been early and ahead of this for a long time, is that um, I think we're seeing a movement of reporters, people with perspective, people with something to say, to do it without a filter, to do it with as a direct relationship with readers and listeners. And I've been writing about this for a while and seeing it take place, and I thought it was possible. I believed in what people like you are doing, and said it's time for me to give it a shot. So along with going and leaving and spending more time, getting the word out about Always Day One, I wanted to start my own publication. So I did, went to Substack. I've had discussions with the Substack guys for a while, and, I trust them. I think it's a good platform and a good place to start out. So I'm starting this new newsletter called Big Technology on Substack. And it's not entirely new. Like, I've been writing a newsletter for BuzzFeed called the Tech Giant Update. But again, trying to do that in between stories. Now I'm going to make the newsletter my main focus. And I'm sure, like, you've done this, right? When you send a newsletter and you have people that reply, and then you can start having a conversation with them. That's so rewarding, so much more rewarding than putting it on a website. So I'm really looking forward to that back and forth interaction with subscribers. And then, I'm going to do a podcast as well. And if people subscribe to the newsletter, then they'll be able to get heads up when the podcast comes out. But to me, the best part of my day is spent speaking with interesting people and trying to figure out what their worldview is like. And, I just think that it would be pretty cool to be able to release those conversations to the world. And so I'm right now trying to find a partnership with a media company. I've had a couple of good conversations so far where like we would do like a sort of an audience for revenue, audience for content trade and then a revenue split. Essentially saying, I think I have a pretty good idea of how to make this content. You have an established audience. I want to start big. And so the idea would be to do this partnership. They help drive listeners, and I'll go out there and make sure to make great audio. And so I think by the end of June we'll have something to announce on that front.
That's awesome. Yeah, one of the things, going back to the kind of the social media conversation and the algorithms, I keep going back and forth on. There's definitely this value of rather than write an article, put it into a publication on the web, and then have that distributed through social media and hope that the algorithm gods are kind and give you a big boost. Email is still one of the best ways to deliver content, right? You have that relationship directly with the reader. Recently, I've had two separate people say, yes, but don't forget that Google, of all companies, could put you in the promotions tab, right? And there can be a little bit of filtering there as well. And so how have you just thought about, there's the content creation, but then there's the delivery. And so it sounds like you're pursuing still written and audio, so kind of two different channels there. But any thoughts about just like what you can do to continue to, really cultivate a relationship directly with the reader or the listener and kind of wean yourself off the dependency on some of these larger platforms?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's a reality today. Like anyone who says that email is totally filter free is probably kidding themselves. Like you definitely are going through a filter with email, like you mentioned, Google's or, Microsoft's if you're sending there. The one thing that I found really amazing about email is just that like when you go, and inbox is a pretty sacred space for people. People get mad if they see a bad email. Yeah, they're okay if they see a bad tweet. So even if it's in the promotions tab. So there's a lot of trust coming in. And you have to, I think from my perspective, when I'm going to send an email, I'll make sure that it's going to be worth somebody opening it if they do decide to make that click. And then, people have controls, right? Like you can drag an email, and I've done this with plenty of newsletters that I like. I've seen it show up in my promotions tab. I can drag it into my main inbox and say, Google will say, do you want this to appear here from now on? And I'll do that. But yeah, ultimately we are at the mercy of big technology company algorithms, whether we like it or not. And I think the thing that we can do is give ourselves our best chance to be able to cut through the noise. And so if you ask me, would you rather send an email or send a tweet? An email is a much, much better way to do it. I mean, I'll do both. But I just think the two-way communication on email is so great. And there's something else is nice about it. I don't know if you found this with sending your email, but the privacy is cool, where people feel that comfortable to share thoughts they wouldn't share like as a reply on Twitter. Like a reply on Twitter, typically you'll get like, you're a dumbass and here's why. A reply on email, you might actually get something civil and something constructive and a way to think about the issue in a different way. And then more stories will come that way. So I'm pretty freaking excited to get sending. And over the past week, I was going through some of the replies to the Tech Giant update, and just like, man, like a lot of people were like, send these more often. And I was like, yeah, but I'm writing stories full time. So to be able to combine that is something I'm stoked for.
Yeah, I could definitely vouch for the idea that the feedback is much, much more thoughtful via email. Sometimes literally people write back like paragraphs and paragraphs. And I'm like, wow, you really care, right? Like you really were listening and thoughtful about this. So definitely agree there. How do you think that this affects, right? Like going from working at a large publication where when you reach out to sources or anything like that, it's a BuzzFeed reporter is reaching out, to now it's Alex is reaching out, right? And you're going to build the name of a publication, but on day one, you are better known than the publication, right? Now, over time, hopefully
Hmm.
that kind of flips, but how do you think that that affects, one, the stories that you can kind of get access to, the relationship with sources, and maybe kind of talk through if you did any analysis there or thinking as to whether that would change the way that you actually could cover some of this stuff?
Yeah, it's going to be hard. Like, I don't think it's going to be easy. Like, you have to, in this world, you have to earn it, right? People are going to see big technology. Many of them have never seen a story from it, never even seen my intro post. And so I'm going to have to go and earn trust and make a mark by, producing big, hard-hitting stories. And so, like, my goal, like, I'm going to give it a couple of weeks before launch because I have a couple I'm reporting out, but I want to come out guns blazing. And then, like, the other thing is that, like, I kind of know what this is like, because I was one of the original members in BuzzFeed's Silicon Valley Bureau, and we came on the scene, and BuzzFeed had done some tech content before, but it wasn't known to be a hard-hitting tech desk, and so we had to literally prove to the world that we were capable of doing the work that they should pay attention to, and that required a lot of hard work. That required, getting on the phone, and sometimes sources are just like, okay, but BuzzFeed, or they were like, I'll speak to anyone. That's one I love. Oh, okay, you're for BuzzFeed. I'll speak to anyone. Which was literally what happened to me. People were like, oh, I thought this was for Ad Age. Now people would much rather speak to BuzzFeed than Ad Age, I think. Um, and so, yeah, we had to work hard. We had to punch hard, and we couldn't go into it with an ego or a narrative, right? I feel like if you go in knowing what you're doing, and then writing original pieces, not narrative driven pieces, you go in writing stuff that people actually get value out of, not like the 10th version of the story that everybody's written. That's where you're going to make people want to start to speak with you. And I mean, I don't know, like, to me, the cool thing about starting this on my own is if I get this right, I can keep it, you know, that's pretty neat.
For sure. And I think part of the allure of going out on your own, right, for journalists that I've seen do this, is, hey, look, I got to write the stories that I want to write, right? And it's not to say that they couldn't always do that, but there's definitely editors and kind of other things at play when you're writing stories. And so that's an attractive component to it. But what you lose is those editors, you lose some of the support staff,
Mm.
you lose some of the resources. So kind of how have you thought about the pros and cons of those large organizations, right? You get some freedom, but you also lose some resources, and just kind of like, how do you balance that in your head and think about it as you kind of start now?
Yeah. So, I mean, I've done 7 years as a full-time reporter after starting out freelance. And I feel like if I were to do this starting out, I wouldn't know what I was doing. Like, I mean, I started out, doing Forbes blogging when Forbes would let lots of people, go and use its platform. And that was like a good learning moment for me. And it was a way for me to sort of make mistakes in real time. Um, Now, like, I feel like I have an idea, of what I'm doing, and I feel confident that I'll be able to find the stories that are going to cut through. And, like, with my newsletter beforehand, I think that watching the type of stuff that I would write and how it would resonate with people was like a good chance for me to sort of give this a shot, experiment a little bit, and see if it could be something more broad. I feel like everyone could use an editor. Like, you can't replace the value an editor brings. Um, so while I'm excited to start assigning myself stories, I am going to miss that second set of eyes. This isn't something interesting that Ben Smith brought up in one of his recent columns about, people going out and going independent, whether it's celebrities or like, you know, um, people with influential tech followings or like B-list journalists like myself. It's like uh, the services that are um, there for you, like Substack, may eventually start doing something like, once they get enough people, are they going to have an editor on call that you can just, give a call to and talk a little bit about? I could see that happening. Are they going to have healthcare? Okay, that might be more of a stretch, but the editor thing certainly possible. And until that day, like, when I have something that's pretty, controversial or I'm not sure about, I'll just gut check it. Like, I'm lucky to have friends who are reporters, who, I probably can't ask them every day, but every now and again, I'm sure I can say, hey, can you just take a look at this before I hit the publish button? And I don't know if it's going to be something that will be smooth all the time. Like, it will definitely have hiccups in the way that working in an established media corporation, um, you know, wouldn't have as many of. And, my approach to this is to admit that that's going to happen, to ask my readers to trust me, to admit when I mess up, because I will, and to learn and grow from it.
Yeah, look, you already know this, but I'd be remiss if I didn't tell you. The whole key is the persistence of just doing it in a very disciplined manner, right? Hey, if I'm going to write every Monday, and you definitely make the mistakes and stuff. But I think I've been writing on Substack for 2 years now, actually, as of May, and that's probably the most defendable thing I've done. Is I just did it every day, right? And a lot of other people started out and then stopped at some point. How do you think about this changing the content you write? And what I mean by that is when you're writing a story at BuzzFeed, it's less your opinion and it's much more kind of reporting the facts. Now you do have that trust of the reader, right? They're subscribing to hear from you. Do you think that leads to more opinionated pieces? Do you want to write more opinion? Like, talk a little bit about how you kind of balance the opinion component, given that now it's less, hey, I'm just reading this on BuzzFeed and maybe I don't know or I haven't paid attention to who the writer is, to now, no, I'm specifically getting this because I've chosen to get content from Alex.
Yeah, I mean, I think the reporting will lead the way. So people are going to hear the reporting first and then my opinion second. But I think that there's definitely going to be more opinion in the stuff that I write, and I'm excited to do that. I don't think there should be in any form of journalism. Well, actually, maybe that's debatable, but like every venue, you should have, if you have an opinion, you should have the ability to write it. Otherwise, we're holding stuff back from readers, and who does that, what type of good does that do? I'm not into it. So yeah, I think the readers of this newsletter will hear what I think for real. There might be surprised, like I talked about narratives. Like, oftentimes coverage goes in narratives. People say, what's the big story, and then they all try to advance. And I'm just kind of skeptical of that a lot of the time. Like, people will not hear, after reading a story in the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal and BuzzFeed and Fortune and Forbes, they won't see my, same story. They're going to see a different perspective from me. So it's going to be, there'll be a lot of first person. There'll be some opinion. I mean, my book is like a good example. And in Always Day One, you'll see the reporting lead. I feel like a reader can kind of get lost in the reporting, and then I'll bring it back into like what I saw and what I felt. And yeah, like, I think it'll be a two-way conversation. It will be me learning from subscribers, them learning from me, and who knows, like, it might go in different interesting directions. We could get spiritual. We can think about, things like meaning, which I think is important to think about when you think about tech. And ultimately, I'll just let that two-way discussion drive.
Yeah, it's really interesting too, because you keep mentioning this two-way discussion, and it's almost like what you actually end up doing is you end up building a community, right? And that community is there to kind of consume the content that you're creating, but then the discussion afterwards, there's kind of intellectual satisfaction to it, but also too, that's what ultimately brings value as well. And so as part of that, like, how do you think about monetizing all of this? Is this there's some for free and some that people will pay? Is it an ad supported model? Like, how do you we're talking about it as if you've been doing it for years. Obviously you're just starting, but like what does that monetization look like, as you see it today?
Yeah. So I have like 3 main monetization goals. One is, I'll just do the easy one first, to sell another book. So to me, that is the first thing I'm going to do, is do my best to get Always Day One out there as much as I can. And hopefully that gives me another opportunity to write another book. Second, with the newsletter, I'm going to go to a model of a free article probably a free article a week, and then maybe 2 or 3 for subscribers only through the week. So it will be reader supported. And then third will be the podcast. Like I mentioned, I'm going to try to build a big audience on that, and then just do a revenue share with a media company. I mean, if with the podcast and the newsletter, like I'm kind of curious what you think about this, but like if the podcast does really well or the newsletter does really well, then maybe I can, make the other one free. Like if the newsletter crushes it, probably do like the podcast like ad free. Or if the podcast gets a big audience, then I can move and make the newsletter, free to everyone. To me, they all reinforce each other. And I'm not, my goal isn't to get rich off of this. My goal is to sort of be able to do this type of work that I love to do and share, what I know about these companies and what I know about the tech world, without an end date, in a way that I can support myself independently, and not be reliant on somebody else to give me the permission to do that.
I think you're thinking about it the right way. I mean, that's what's so crazy about all this, right? And I've obviously thought a lot about it, but I forget the woman's name who coined the term of the passion economy, with basically this idea that look, you only need a couple hundred people to pay for whether it's reader or listener supported content, and most people could replace their salary, right, with just a couple hundred people. And so what's I think really interesting is when you see journalists leaving to go start this, you did a pretty good job outlining, like, it's the same body of work. Yeah, there's some tweaks and maybe with some less resources, whatever, but like, you're still writing about the things that you were writing about and want to write about. You're just choosing to monetize that work in a different way. And it involves taking more risk, right? Because if you're unsuccessful in getting people to pay for it, then obviously you make less money, but you also have uncapped upside. And so it's very interesting to kind of see, some people are very attracted to that. And some people say, hey, look, just pay me my paycheck. And, I don't want to ever think about monetization in my life. I just want to do my work. And so it's kind of cool now that the tools are in place for other people who previously didn't have this, avenue to pursue. They have it now, right?
Totally. Yeah. And, I've a high risk tolerance. And I've been, started out on the business side as opposed to starting out in journalism. So I've seen the changes in the media industry, reported on the changes in media and social media, and, succeed or fail, like, this will be a cool experience to kind of see what it's all about once I get out there.
I love that attitude. Before I finish up, I always ask 2 questions, and then you get to ask me 1 question to finish. What is the most important book that you've ever read other than your own?
I love the book, The Forever War. It's by Dexter Filkins. Have you read it?
Fantastic book. Yes.
I'm getting chills just thinking about it, because we're never going to have, for your listeners who haven't read it, it's a book by this correspondent who'd been at the New York Times and the New Yorker covering the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. And I don't think we're ever going to have another book like this, because he was sort of the last war reporter to write a book about what it was like to embed with people who were fighting with the US, where they still needed the filter. There was no YouTube for the Taliban to use when he was in Afghanistan. And so he got unbelievable access and is able to tell this fascinating first-person story about the sort of repercussions of the US action in those 2 countries. And I think that, I don't know, I just was blown away by every single chapter that he told. And I think that it's a good read for anyone that's trying to figure out sort of what actually happens when the US goes in and invades, because too often our networks won't really show us what's happening there. Our newspapers won't cover the full story. They do a good job getting the basic details, but we don't really see the extent. And I think the book does a really good job of that.
Yeah, it's one of these books that not only has great content, kind of the access and just information you can't get anywhere else, and then it's also very well written as well, right? A lot of times you get one or the other. This one has both, and man, I read that a while ago, but that's a fantastic
Yeah.
suggestion. Second question is a more fun one, which is aliens, believer or non-believer?
Oh, Pomp, you got me on the tough one here at the end. I'm gonna just say that if we had, if there are aliens out there, I'll be shocked but not surprised. Like,
Okay,
you
why?
know, because math says there should be, but we haven't seen any of them yet. And I know there's that theory that, like, maybe most civilizations get to a certain point and then they annihilate themselves. And right now that seems fairly believable. So it's possible that all the other aliens have annihilated themselves at this point, and we haven't really made contact with them. But I mean, when you think about it, universe is big, and the chance of another Earth-like planet is not out of the picture. So, if they're here, oh yeah, like you remember when there was that comet that was came pretty close, and I think I had tweeted something like, appreciate your interest in visiting, but we're going through some shit right now. Maybe try another time. That would sort of be my message to the aliens, like, or maybe they should come now because, might as well, deal with all the crap at one time.
That would be the most
Yeah,
on-brand 2020 thing ever, right? Is like, oh,
totally.
aliens came
Yeah,
too. Like, of course they did.
exactly. What do you think, Pop?
uh, I definitely think that the math suggests that there's other life, right? I cheat because I've asked this question out of 300 people
Yeah,
and I've heard every
right.
variation of answer. But I think the two big questions are you talking about life or intelligent life? So let's just say that we're talking intelligent life. Okay, math would suggest it's out there somewhere. But then two, and I forget who's the person who originally said this to me as part of their answer, but they said, yes, but then you have to cut it also by time. And what they basically were saying is like the odds from, if you just look at how vast the galaxy is that there is other intelligent life out there, but they could have been here a million years ago. Right. Or they could be here a million years from now. And I said, look, you're blowing my mind to the point where like, I feel, like it, not only small, insignificant, and also just really stupid, right? Because these things are so complex.
Yeah.
But look, the math suggests it, and so from a probability standpoint, it is probably out there, but we haven't identified it. Like that's the other thing is right is have we already discovered them and just haven't said it yet? I don't go that far.
Have you seen the videos of the flying saucers that are being captured by the Air Force? And are you buying and selling on the idea that that's extraterrestrial life?
So I've seen them. I don't know what to think of them, frankly. And really what I mean by that is there's two pieces to it. One is there's something there, right? Unless they're like literally it's a optical illusion or something, but it appears that something's there. Two is the part that actually makes the argument around alien life or something else the most believable to me is actually the fact that there's multiple reports of things that we can't explain with physics today, right? So, hey, we've got this understanding of science, but something that we saw we can't explain through what we're seeing. Look, there was plenty of things in science we didn't understand 100 years ago that we now understand today because of technology, whatever. So doesn't mean that we can't figure it out. But just like that to me is probably one of the more compelling arguments for like why aliens would exist.
Okay, I got one last question for you. Sorry,
All
I've
right.
taken over your interview, but you
No, go
really
ahead.
sparked a topic of interest for me. All right, so I'm sure you have friends in the tech world who believe that we're in a simulation. So how do you react when you hear that?
2020, anything's possible. No, I think that it's again, it's a probability thing, right? People way smarter than me have done all the math and can rattle it off. I don't know how probable it is. What I would say is when you start to go down this path of like simulation, aliens, whatever. I actually kind of come at it weird because look, from a life experience standpoint, right? Like I went to Iraq, right? I was
Hmm.
at war, like I saw all of that kind of stuff. And you just get reminded, like, we're all going to die. Right. And so,
Hmm.
like, is it a simulation? Are there aliens, like war, all this chaos, whatever? Like, we're all going to die. And you and I are about the same age. You just kind of start thinking, like, yeah, I think I've got like another 50 years or so. Right. Like that's what the
Hmm.
math would tell me is, probability wise. But that could be not happen and I could die tomorrow. And so it's just like, let's just enjoy what we have. Right. Like, let's go
Yeah.
live our
Yeah.
lives. Let's go do the cool shit now, because if we're living in a simulation or anything else, like, I almost don't want to know. Right. It's like, let me believe
Yeah.
that I'm actually doing the things that I want to do.
Yeah. That's like the old question, like, if you knew the day you were going to die, would you want to know? Nah, no thanks. Keep that away from me.
For sure. So where can we
Mhm.
send people to, one, find the book, and then two, to sign up for big technology?
Yeah. So if you Google Always Day One or Bing Always Day One, or type it into whatever weird search engine you use, you'll be able to find it everywhere: Amazon, Barnes and Noble, Bookbound, the whole deal. Apple Books, if that's your cup of tea. I haven't been banned on Apple Books yet, so that's good. And the newsletter is just bigtechnology.substack.com. And yeah, that thing will be firing up any day now. So I'd love to see you all there.
Awesome, man. Well, we'll link to both of those in the description as well. And then appreciate you doing this. Best of luck as you go down this path, because I think it's pretty cool that you're doing it, and I got no doubt that you're going to be pretty successful.
Yeah, thank you, Pop. I'm looking forward to continuing to listen.